Hello, I'm Brad Jansen, a senior manager in the national office. Today we're talking about the equity method of accounting, and specifically factors to consider when assessing significant influence. The equity method of accounting provides a model to measure and account for investments in another entity. It applies when an investor is able to exercise significant influence over the operating and financial policies of the investee, but does not have control. The ownership of a single voting share provides an investor some degree of influence, so each analysis should begin with an evaluation of the number of voting shares owned. Now, the accounting guidance presumes that when an investor owns 20% or more of the voting shares, the level of influence they have is significant. However, that 20% metric is not a bright line. In practice, certain investors with less than 20% may have the ability to exercise significant influence. In these instances, the investor usually has other forms of involvement with the investee beyond just the common stock investment. These other forms of involvement may provide them the opportunity to assert influence. The key is to determine all other forms of involvement. So what are some other common forms of influence to consider? Well, participation on the investee's board of directors, whether contractual or not, is a form of influence that's usually significant. Influence can also come from other forms of investment in addition to the common stock, such as holding preferred stock or debt securities of the investee. Special rights, such as protective rights or veto rights, can also provide influence. The more the investor has the ability to participate in decisions, the more likely it is they can exercise significant influence. Material transactions between the entities could also provide an investor influence. For example, if an investor purchased a significant portion of the investee's output. A few other factors listed in the accounting guidance include interchange of management personnel, technological dependencies between the investor and the investee, and the extent of ownership by an investor in relation to other investors. For example, if an investor had 15% ownership of an entity while all other shareholders had a de minimis percentage, this may elevate the investor's level of influence. Now, this can go the other way too. The accounting guidance provides a list of indicators that could represent evidence that an investor is unable to exercise significant influence, despite owning 20% or more of the entity. For example, say a company owns 20% of an entity, but is blocked by a judicial decree. In this scenario, they may be unable to exercise their influence. In another example, assume the investee's majority ownership is concentrated among a small group of shareholders, and they operate without any regard to the views of the 20% investor. In that situation, if the investor continually tries and fails to obtain a board seat, this could be a scenario where there is evidence the investor does not have the ability to exercise significant influence despite their ownership level. But the key here is to determine if the investor is really unable to exercise their influence. Being a passive investor or not having a history or future plans to exert influence is not enough. The accounting guidance is based on the ability to exercise significant influence, not the intent. So determining whether the equity method of accounting applies starts with an understanding of the various ways the investor may assert influence. Once all those factors are identified, the key is to objectively assess the balance of evidence to see if that influence as a whole is significant.